Pleasure to meet you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So, as you know, with the retrospective that Paul Branco is organizing, I would like to discuss your films with you, your career, also particularly your generation of filmmakers, because I believe it's a very strong period in American film in which you play a very important part, and then also looking on the things you have made now recently. Later on in the interview. So, first of all, you started filming for television, doing documentaries for television, and one of the things that I believe that comes through in your work in fiction is how you capture the tension from reality and then use it for fictional purposes. I believe that shooting documentary for you must have been very important, and especially the experience of shooting in Chicago at night, for instance. I may believe that's where you do get part of that tension that you use in your films.
Well, I actually began doing live television in Chicago right out of high school. And I started in the mailroom of a television station and worked my way up, became a floor manager, which is like an assistant director in films. Mm-hmm. And then I started to do, after live television, documentary films. Mm. And the first documentary I made was about a black man who was on death row. And I made the film primarily to try and save his life, because he was going to go to the electric chair. Mm-hmm. And we made this film. I had no idea how to make a film. Mm. I had done live television, but the techniques are completely different. Mm. And the materials are different, the equipment's different, everything.
Sure.
But it was that documentary and the fact that it helped in getting him released from prison, ultimately, that led me to believe that cinema was a very honorable thing that could be done, and that you could save a person's life with cinema. Mm-hmm. And that if you could do that, you could maybe bring about change for a better world. Mm-hmm. But when I got out to Hollywood, I was quickly dispelled of that notion. Because Hollywood is not about that at all. Not at all. It's not about saving a life or saving the world. Mm-hmm. It's about making money. Mm-hmm. And it's called, in America, film is not about the art form of cinema. It's about the business of cinema. It's not called show art, it's called show business. and that's what it is. Mm-hmm. It's show business. Mm-hmm. And it was less so in the 1970s. There was a lot of experimentation. There was a lot of interesting young filmmakers who were mostly influenced by the French New Wave. Sure. And the angry young men of Great Britain, and of course Italian neorealism. Mm-hmm. And the new Italian cinema of the 1960s. Mm-hmm. Antonioni and Fellini, mm-hmm. and Rossellini, of mm-hmm. course, and Visconti, mm-hmm. and some of the, and even, you know, the films that were produced by people like Ponti and De Laurentiis mm-hmm. had a great influence on my generation. Mm-hmm. And they had more of an influence on the Americans who made film in the 70s than American film. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. American film had very little influence on us. Mm-hmm. Some, but not a lot. Mm-hmm. We were not all that interested or involved with John Ford, you know, or the great American filmmakers until much later.
Mm-hmm. This documentary, The People vs. Paul Crump, it's interesting because it sort of feels like if you read its synopsis, it sort of feels like a Hitchcock movie, because it's about someone who is not guilty, who is arrested and is in prison, and it is a documentary. But I believe what then people got interested in it because there was so much tension in it, and eventually then you made your first films, especially when you made the French Connection. There was a very strong sense of reality in it, despite being a fiction film.
That's certainly because of documentary. I learned from doing documentaries that you could induce a documentary style to a fiction film, you know, and that's what I wanted to do when I went to make fiction films. Induce the style of a documentary. And many of my early films have that. Even in its own way, The Exorcist appears to be a documentary of this story. It's not done like a horror film or fantasy or surrealism. It's done straight ahead, as though this is actually happening. And that comes from the fact that I learned to make films by doing documentaries.
It's interesting you mentioned the French New Wave, because Enrique Bravo, the camera operator in the French Connection, he took pictures of Castro in Cuba. And
that's right.
Raoul Coutard, the camera operator for Breathless by Godard, he actually shot the war in Asia, in Indochina, with so it's interesting to see the same things happening in your side of...
Ricky Bravo was at Castro's side during the Cuban Revolution, and then he became disillusioned with Castro and moved to America. And one of the first films he did was with me, The French Connection. And it was because he was so facile, so capable to make a documentary look in the same way that I would stage it, that those films look as they do. If it was a different kind of cameraman that I had met, it would not look, the films would not look the same.
As you said, it does feel that when we watch a film like The French Connection, and even other films by other film directors from this period, it does feel that they were influenced by, let's say, doing different films, sort of exposing this sense of reality behind fiction, and just go behind an existing facade that would be in film studios. So when you said it, you weren't particularly interested in films of John Ford, you would rather see what was happening in Italy and France. This is something that we can apply in American film in the 70s. So it was sort of like a revolution in itself, even against
We didn't realize that, though. It may have been a revolution, but we weren't trying to do that. We just had these powerful influences from Europe, and that was reflected in all of our work, even though we were all Americans, so that the influences of Europe were filtered through an American sensibility, which the other filmmakers of my generation had. It was an American sensibility. And so later, much later, I discovered, well, even like the films of Buster Keaton, which are masterpieces, the silent films of Keaton. I hadn't seen any of that stuff before I started making films. But years later, I saw how inventive, how ingenious were the American silent films. And but I knew Fritz Lang's silent films before I knew those of John Ford and Buster Keaton. And then when John Ford made sound films, I could see how, you know, because films beget films. There is a sense that all filmmakers really are colleagues. and all borrow from each other, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. But there is a language of cinema that is universal, and it's understood everywhere. In China, in Portugal, in Austin, Texas. And all of the work that has been done over the, not long, not much more than not even 200 years of cinema, which is a very young art and has a long, I'm sure, circuitous route. All films seem to influence everything that follows them. Let me stop for a second.
Sure.
I'll bring us in a pot of tea.
Thanks for the tea.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure.
I think one thing that could apply also to your generation, but I think is really particular of your films,
Yes.
is of course the tension between good and evil in people, especially how our experiences of life can change man's behavior and essentially corrupt them. This of course can be seen in a film like The French Connection through the character of Gene Hackman, but also throughout your other films. And I was thinking that you have said that the one film that played a particular impact on you is Citizen Kane.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, this is something that we could discuss American film in the 70s and your own films with these ideas, but can also apply to Charles Foster Kane and Citizen Kane. Again, good and evil, what can he do that may be good for others and himself, and the contrary, and how he influences other people and society around him in a good or a bad way.
Citizen Kane has been not only the greatest influence on me, but so many of the filmmakers that have followed, and in my generation. It was not a financial success, but it has achieved a success far beyond anything else, in that it's so many students of film have learned how to make film and been inspired to make film just by watching Citizen Kane. I was. I realized, sometimes an artist, a painter, will be inspired by a particular painting or a style of painting. The Impressionists or painters of the Renaissance inspired all those that came after them, the German Expressionists, but that reached a point where you could be inspired by such work, but you could never reproduce it. So filmmakers have had to seek other ways to express themselves. Many have been able to, many have not been able to express themselves in as original a way as Citizen Kane, but so many of us have been inspired by it because it embodied all of the very best work in cinematography, editing, producing, directing, screenwriting, acting, every imaginable art of cinema is at its best in Citizen Kane. As you can take some of the great paintings of all time, the portraits of Rembrandt. No one can do portraits like that. There are many modern painters who did very interesting portraits. Lucian Freud, there are many you could cite, but none have the mastery of Rembrandt. Rembrandt inspired a whole school of painting, and Orson Welles inspired a whole school of filmmaking. So that everything that came after either had to follow Citizen Kane or break with it.
But even the character of Charles Foster Kane, we see the movie and we're not really sure at the end of it if he is a good guy or a bad guy.
No, well, no one is. There's no such thing. There's good and evil in everyone. Read the Confessions of St. Augustine. and you'll see a man who was, you know, nominated and became a saint, who has confessed all of the sins of the flesh that most people have experienced. And that's in all the films I've done. I don't have heroes in my films. There's good and evil in everyone. I believe that. That, you know, and I believe it's a constant struggle for our best, our better angels to appear. And sometimes they don't. But even the best of people all have faults. Some of the people that are most revered have sinned as much as, you know, normal people are constantly dealing with guilt, and we wish we had treated people differently, and everyone experiences this, except in certain, like American films, where you have comic book heroes,
Right.
you know, that represent pure good and no evil. And I believe that this has wrongly influenced many generations.
When you started making films, it was a very particular moment in the history of the United States, because we had a war in Vietnam. It kind of felt that the country was angry against itself and what it was doing. And in the interview you made with Fritz Lang that you filmed, there's a certain part where Fritz Lang says, no one and no country cannot be affected by a war in which it is involved in.
Yes, of course.
So this, of course, we can also apply this to American film at that time, and what you were dealing as a country and as people also.
We felt, all the filmmakers of my generation, that the Vietnam War was an absolute horrible folly that our government had gotten us into. There was no reason for the Vietnam War, and America accomplished nothing. And I don't even, its stated goal was ridiculous, to try and save a country from its own political direction. And we're still trying to do that. We're still trying to influence countries to think as we do. And I've lived all over the world, and I don't believe that's possible. I lived in Iraq, and I felt very close to the Iraqi people. I filmed The Exorcist there, and I got to know people in all walks of lives, and they're wonderful people. And American soldiers have killed, we don't know how many Iraqis have been killed. They won't give us the figure. It's probably hundreds of thousands. And so, and there's nothing that will come out of this Iraq war. Saddam was a dictator, yes, and is the world a better place because Saddam is gone? Yes, it is. Of course it is. And Gaddafi and others. But I don't believe in America as the policeman of the world. I don't think America can do that. I think America should keep its own house clean and defend other countries when they ask America for help. I don't think America should simply intervene because we want to have our political philosophy of democracy prevail. There are many countries where democracy may never prevail.
Speaking of Fritz Lang, one of the things that is very important in his films and yours as well is the source of evil. I'm not trying to explain it, of course, because it is impossible, but it is something that we can see throughout his films, something where he tries to focus his own insight and through his characters. This sort of the notion of social evils, if that exists or not, and where does evil come from. It is where part of the tension of his films, and in my belief in yours as well, that grabs our eye to what's happening. And
Well, Lang's films were totally provoked in many ways by something that was stirring in the minds and hearts of the German people in the late 20s and early 30s, in the period between the two world wars. Lang's most important films were made in Germany just before the time that the National Socialists took over the country. And Lang was, of course, as he told me in the interview I did with him, asked to head up the German film industry then, and he refused, and he left the country. But he had predicted in a series of films he did about a character called Dr. Mabuse, who was based on Hitler and the Nazi movement. Lang saw this coming. It was in the streets, and he and others, people like Billy Wilder and William Dieterle and other very important German directors who went to America with the outbreak of World War II, and even before, with the accession to power of Hitler. Mm-hmm. They saw this coming. They were very prophetic. Mm-hmm. I didn't see, although a lot of the films of the 70s were a reaction to the Vietnam War, we had no solutions to the problems of the country, nor were we prophetic about them. Most of the films of the 70s simply reflected the horrible reality of Vietnam, from which America's never recovered. And America around that time had a kind of national nervous breakdown that included, that started in the 60s with the murder of John F. Kennedy, and then in 1968 of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King. That, coupled with the Vietnam War, America just having come out of a stupid war in North Korea, caused the country to have a violent shift in its attitudes, in its self-confidence, and I don't believe it's been regained. America today is not as I remember it as a young person at all. And there's a vacuum of leadership that's only rarely been breached. And we don't make films about that. For one reason, we can't. The movie companies would not finance such a film. Recently, I know, Italian filmmakers have tried to make films about the Second World War and the post-war period, and even about the current leadership. They've made films about Berlusconi. I think Nanni Moretti, I think, is the director who's done it. We couldn't do that in America. Oliver Stone made a film about Richard Nixon long after it was agreed that Richard Nixon was kind of a villain. Goebbels saw that cinema was going to be a very powerful tool for the National Socialists. He believed that there was no television then, or he would have used television, much as Orwell predicted in 1984. But Goebbels understood that cinema could show, physically portray, the idea of German supremacy. And he wanted Lang to supervise that kind of film, and Lang wouldn't do it. Lang had no interest in making those kinds of films. And very few American filmmakers would want to make a film promoting, the policies of America today.
Of course. But even though your generation of filmmakers in the 70s, they were in the United States, we feel they were the first generation which presented itself as authors who wanted artistic control over their movies in every area of creation. When we look back to the previous generation, for instance, Orson Welles, who was a genius of filmmaking, but he only had final cut of Citizen Kane, and that's all. Do you feel that it is true your generation were those who had artistic control, who just made the films they wanted to make with no intervention of film studios?
Not universally, but to some extent. Now, if you had great success, you could get that. Because the people who ran the studios then knew that there was something happening that they didn't understand. And they thought that we did, simply because we were young, and for no other reason. I mean, we didn't know any more than anybody else. But we were young. Would you like some more, Paulo?
Help yourself.
Just help yourself. We were young, and it turned out that the films were being seen then mostly by young people. And so these older guys who ran the studios figured they didn't know what the hell was going on. They were making films, big budget American musicals like Dr. Dolittle, and the audience was no longer interested in that.
Right.
Big stars and family dramas, but they were more interested in films that came out of the European film industry as reflected in things like Easy Rider. And so they let a lot of us get away with cutting our own films. But it wasn't as though we had carte blanche. I mean, they wanted to fire us every day. They really wanted to take control. But they didn't, because they wouldn't know what to do with the film.
It did represent the end of a certain idea of a film studio, and how film studios in the US were associated to certain actors and certain genres. You tried yourself with two colleagues of yours, Francis Ford Coppola and Bogdanovich, to create a production company, right? Director's company. Within this generation, with the idea of sort of fighting the big studios and making different films?
No, not at all.
Did you want to make the same thing? You wanted to have this powerful company?
No, the company was started by the man who owned Paramount Pictures. He owned a big corporation called Gulf and Western. His name was Charlie Bluedorn. And he had just bought Paramount, and they had the great success of The Godfather and Love Story and several other films of that time. And he started the director's company. He came to us because he thought we would be able to make smaller budget films that would be more in touch with that generation's audiences. He specified that we needed to make commercial films, not to make small personal films. And we started the company with the agreement that that's what we would do. We were not given the right to, and we didn't start the company. He did, for the purposes I've just stated.
Well, let's say a certain failure of the original idea of why you were making films and the kind of films you wanted to make when you...
No. I knew that it was changing, but I understand that every generation has their own zeitgeist, what they want to see, what they want to read, what music they want to listen to. this generation doesn't listen to the music that I listened to in the 60s at all. It's over. So the great music of the 60s that changed the world and influenced countries like Czechoslovakia to undertake a revolution. The powerful American music of that period is no longer regarded at all. It's a different world in music, in cinema, in the arts. There are different standards. And you know, this is not something that you can reverse or turn around or stop. Each generation creates its own art, you know? And
Sure.
I mean, Vincent van Gogh saw the world differently from everybody else. And at the time he did his paintings, no one could see the world in that way. And now, you know, it's almost impossible to buy a Van Gogh, and they were giving them away when he was alive. And that was a change in the zeitgeist, a change in the valuation of painting. And I understand that there is that in cinema and in music. I mean, theater has changed completely from what it was in the 1930s and 40s in America. Cinema, theater, television, all the arts have changed. And when I saw the rise of the blockbuster in the 70s with Jaws and, well, with Lucas and Spielberg,
Sure.
I saw this happening, but I had no interest in going along the same path.
Of course. You had a huge success with The Exorcist. It's a fascinating film because it shows that people were sort of fascinated by the unknown, even though people generally are, they fear the unknown. The Exorcist, well, it's a film about an exorcism, but it was one of the most popular films ever made, and one of the most praised films ever made. It kind of again draws back to the sense of danger in your films, and how it can be a fascinated theme, let's say, in an extreme context like The Exorcist.
Well, The Exorcist is about the mystery of faith. It's not a horror film. It's a film about the mystery of faith. And even people who profess to have no faith are certainly curious, certainly wonder what's out there. Is there anything after this? And The Exorcist is a kind of an answer to why bad things happen to good people. It works on that level.
History of faith is something very important for a filmmaker like Carl Dreyer.
Oh yeah.
Many films of his are about that.
I saw Ordet before I did The Exorcist, and it gave me the courage to show all of the things I did show. Well, when I saw how effective it was that Dreyer was able to show literal resurrection and make the audience believe in it, and I thought it was a great moment in film. Have you ever seen Ordet?
Yeah. Oh, so many times.
Yeah. And help yourselves.
Thank you.
And so, yeah, Ordet had a great effect on me when I did The Exorcist, more to encourage me to present these supernatural occurrences as realistic.
Right. And afterwards you made a remake of a filmmaker also very close to you, which is Clouseau.
Well, it wasn't a remake, it was a new version. It's like
Right.
if someone were to do a Hamlet
Right.
today, and people who were not gay mostly stayed away from any contact with gay life. And cruising disturbed many people, and people don't like to be disturbed, really. Especially in films today, they want to relax and enjoy themselves and be entertained, because you now have the internet, and all you need to do is go on any internet news site and see all of the massive tragedies and disasters that are happening in the world. So it's not a very good time to make films that upset people. It costs so much money to go to the movies now that people basically want to escape. They're not even that much concerned about having a profound experience. They're more concerned about getting out of the realities in which we all live.
Cruising is a film about our darkest impulses, because we have an undercover policeman who is not gay.
Well, it's of interest to me, certainly, because I find it drama much more interesting than, let's say, something that's meant to be funny than a comedy. I find drama more moving. I'm less moved by comedies, although I was very moved by the comedies of Chaplin and many others, the Marx Brothers, Woody Allen, whose work I love. But I'm not interested in making that kind of film, although I think Woody Allen is a really profound filmmaker, in my view. Probably the best American filmmaker to me. But I'm not interested in doing that sort of thing myself. I'm much more interested in stories about people who live without alternatives, who have their backs against the wall, and they're like specimens in a cage. And that's why I'm so drawn to Harold Pinter, because I learned, I worked with Pinter for a year on his play The Birthday Party, which I turned into a film. And I learned so much about how people use speech to disguise their real meaning, and how irrational fear motivates us all. We're afraid of the knock on the door. Everyone lives with a fear of the knock on the door, that someday somebody's going to come for you and say, it's all over. And that's what Pinter does. One of the singers I've worked with here in Florence on the Macropolis case told me an interesting story. He's from Czechoslovakia. And when he was a young man, he and his school friend wrote a fan letter to the actress Claudia Cardinale. It was a simple, stupid boy's letter. They were teenagers. And they wrote a letter to this beautiful movie actress and saying, "Dear Claudia Cardinale, we love you. Jan Vacek," and he wrote his friend's name, which I've forgotten. And within a matter of days, the authorities knocked on their door and said, "Why are you writing letters to a capitalist actress?" And they were brought in and questioned, and held. And finally, it was realized that they were just some stupid kids, And I thought that was very interesting, because that's the territory that Harold Pinter explores. How for no reason, somebody appears and changes a person's life. So as much as I was drawn to the film of Citizen Kane, I was drawn to The Birthday Party and everything it said and the way it was said. And many people, when The Birthday Party and when Pinter's work first appeared, thought it was kind of absurd and not very intelligible and surrealistic. And now we realize that he was writing about reality. The reality that's within all of us, the irrational fear and the fear of the unknown.
now we have a film director like Quentin Tarantino, who is described as a pulp film director, but I believe that in, let's say, the original pulp film director, maybe yourself, because you do manage to work around these artistic intentions, which is your own artistic universe and influences, and tell a story through it with your own freedom. So this, I wouldn't say conflict, but the importance of making a film and feeling it as art as well as...
Well, I appreciate that. But I usually am attracted to the same kind of stories most of the time. And I was very young when I discovered Pinter and the Birthday Party and decided to make a film of it. And I knew that there would not be a large audience for it, but it was something that I wanted to see and to see preserved. And the year I spent working with him was one of the most productive and fruitful of my life. So, but I tend to be pulled toward the same kind of material, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Paranoia, and irrational fear, and you know, the unknown within a realistic setting. And nobody did that better than Pinter. To some extent, I think Antonioni did in cinema. Occasionally Alain Resnais, and often Hitchcock, you know, worked in the same way, much more commercially. You know, Hitchcock was certainly an artist, but I don't think he would have admitted to that.
And you've been working now with Tracy Letts,
Yeah.
of course, a very important playwright in the U.S., which also has sort of same ideas in his work, also paranoia. The last couple of films you've made are about that also, but they're also very, very free, I believe. Maybe the films where we do feel your freedom as a filmmaker, an artist, and the way you expose your ideas. We sort of feel that right now, at this point, you have absolutely nothing to lose.
That's true.
You just go for it.
Let me just get rid of this. Well, I think that what you're saying is true. I don't really feel as you put it, have a lot to lose. I only follow the work that interests me. And I do very few films now because I don't like so much of the films that are being made, you know, and I understand why they're being made, but they're of no interest to me, or very little, let's say. Sometimes, occasionally, I'll see something that I'm interested in, but when I started making films, I was actively pursuing a career. I was actively trying to become an accomplished filmmaker. And now I don't feel that same impetus, that same energy to do that, but simply to reflect on the kind of material that interests me.
So it also deals with emotions, something very human and simple in our lives.
That's true.
That's it. That's not really a question, but it's...
No, I think you've summarized them very accurately.
Finally, you're here because you're directing an opera.
I directed an opera that opened 2 days ago at the Maggio Musicale in Florence, the Teatro Comunale, and it's the Macropolis case by Leos Janáček, who is now considered a very great composer of the 20th century. And he wrote this opera in 1923, between 1923 and 1925. It was first presented in 1926, and it's an amazingly beautiful work. Very powerful, very moving, I feel. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but it opened the other night and had a tremendous reception. And we worked very hard on it. And they've cast a wonderful group of singers, including a woman named Angela Danoka, who appeared in my Salome in Munich for 4 seasons. And she's easily the best actress I've ever worked with in any medium. If you see it tonight, you'll see what I mean. She's amazing.
Because in opera you do also have to deal with actors, not only singers.
Well, actors, the opera singers want the same thing that good actors want, which is a psychological underpinning for their work, their character, and a staging that works.